Today's video is a little different compared to what we normally do on the channel, which are usually VOD reviews, and instead today we are going to be doing an advanced early game guide. This was requested by somebody within the comments of the last video, so we're going to talk about it today because I figured why not. Today we're going to specifically talk about positioning and we're going to talk about itemization. These are the two probably the more important concepts when it comes to the early game. I did do a video a while back on how to play stage 1 appropriately. This way you are almost guaranteeing yourself a decent 2-1 board. It doesn't work every single time, but you're definitely playing up to your odds. I won't be talking about that in today's video. I will link in the description if that's something that you're interested in. But in today's video, again, we're talking about positioning and itemization. This video is specifically tailored for people who are more within the plat to diamond range, but anything above that as well is perfectly fine. This is really for people who sort of have a decent understanding of the game and they want to keep taking their game to the next level and want to improve, maybe try to make that push into diamond, push into masters, and keep trying to improve at TFT. Obviously, if you're masters and above, maybe there's something in here that you just didn't think about before, and hopefully you can still garner some value out of this video. I will say, it is very fucking late today. It's 9:45 at night. I don't normally make videos at this hour. Usually I do it in the morning. But if you came to my stream, you know why I'm filming this so late. But also, I am filming this video because we are trying to do a daily upload challenge onto YouTube every single day. I got a little over 2 hours left to try to get this video out. But we are trying to do daily videos until December 10th. This is for those who are new to the channel. And this is just a way to challenge myself, try to pump out as much content as I can. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe. I am trying to make that final push into full-time content creation, and we're getting very, very close. But enough about that, enough about me. Let's talk about early game and how to play around it. So let's talk about it, right? Let's simplify the board. Let's not look at the opponent's board real quick, right? First off, let's pretend that this is our early game board. Let's first talk about positioning. How should we position our units? Well, in general, you want to do what is called exiles or default positioning. Default positioning looks usually something along the lines of like this. Now, why do we position our units like this? And why is this considered the default? In general, you want to default to exiles because you want to sort of position your units in a way that won't get punished by things like just random AoE, random CC abilities, random AoE abilities, stuff like that. By positioning your units in an exile fashion, you sort of reduce the likelihood of your units accidentally get caught in the crossfire whenever they get hit stuff by like Cassidy ultis or J4 ultis, Heimerdinger ultis, stuff like that, right? I know this is an early game guide, but I'm naming late game units. You get the idea though, right? This is why this is called the early game, or rather exiles positioning. Now, this is always sort of the default, but there are going to be times when you'd rather clump up your front line. Why would we ever do this, right? Well, let's talk about it, okay? So, in this example, on this gym board, we would never clump up our front line. But, in this example, on our opponent's board, they're going to always want to clump their front line. Why is this the case? The way you position your front line is dependent on the damage type of your carries. Specifically speaking, Jin, on our board, is a single target damage dealer. Right? He focuses one target at a time, trying to, burn down one unit and then go to the next, right? Units like Vel'Koz, units like Malzahar, these are AoE damage abilities. They are trying to hit multiple units at the same time, right? And how do you garner more value out of your abilities when you're playing units such as these with the AoE damage abilities, right? The best way to do it is to clump your front line. By clumping your front line, you are forcing the opponent's front line to also clump too. And by clumping, because, they got to walk up to try and auto things, right? Something like this, right? When that happens, your Vel'Koz, which is targeting the front line and right onto our front line here, and because it's clumped up, it will now shoot its ability and actually hit multiple units. Same with Malzahar. As soon as it casts its ability, it will ideally hit multiple units because they clumped their front line, and it's hitting multiple units here, which is really bad for us, right? There's not much that you can do to really avoid this. This is just sort of how the game is just made, but that's just how it is. Trust me, it's fine though. But like, you should ideally always exiles, because sometimes the opponent doesn't really know that they're spread out something like this, and then you're actually chilling, right? This applies a bit more into the late game, but in general, in the early game, you want to position your front line based off the damage type of your carries. Good stuff. I do want to mention this real quick because I noticed this. I was actually on my second account and I was just climbing on it because, I was really tired. I didn't want to climb on my main account, and I think I had like 2 hours of sleep, so it was really, really bad. I noticed on that account though, I think it's like a plat or diamond account. It's a pretty low elo account. But I noticed on that account, somebody was playing social distancing and they still clumped their front line. Their reasoning being, I think somebody called them out on it because they're trying to be helpful. Like, hey man, are you just not playing social distancing for your front line? And then the guy was super condescending and kind of a dickhead. And he was like, what does AD and AP do for my front line? Like, it matters. it matters. I don't know why they don't think it does, but it matters. Extra AD, extra AP, basically bigger shields, bigger damage. It's just more DPS on the board. It's really, really nice to have. You should always be trying to garner the most value out of your augments whenever you can. That's why, for example, if you ever play something like Cybernetic Bulk, right, a Cybernetic Value or Cybernetic augment of any type, instead of really spreading items first, you kind of spread components first in the early game, stuff like this. Because it's just a better way to just itemize and garner more value out of your augments, stuff like that, right? That's not exactly what we're talking about in today's video, but that's just something I felt, I felt like it needed to be addressed. I will also now mention the second thing to talk about, which is strong side versus weak side. This is another thing that I really wanted to speak about because it's important. It's important. I think this is a concept I didn't really think about this kind of thing until like it was like just like, I don't know, said out loud to me by a friend of mine who was coaching me, who's just absolutely insane at TFT. But he was basically telling me that you need to scout for weak side and strong side whenever you are playing TFT. What does that mean? For example, let's look at our board, right? In our board, let's ignore the opponent's board for a second, right? In our board, which is weak side, which is strong side? The correct answer is that Aurelia is going to always be on our strong side and our Set is going to be on our weak side, right? The idea being is that Aurelia is a stronger tank than Set, so this is our strongest frontliner, right? This is really important to understand because, well, one, if you have something like a Gargoyles, I mean, this doesn't really apply to this, but if you have a Gargoyles, you want to do something like this, right? Obviously. But identifying your strongest tank, very crucial, fundamental, easy, understandable. But the more important thing is because you need to be able to notice this on your opponent's board. And why does this matter, right? It matters because in this example, right, our opponent has Casting 2, Taric 1. Our strong side on the opponent is the Casting 2, right? It's on the left side. This means that the way that we position our units actually changes. And in fact, we know that because this is the strong side, we want to position on the opposite and position on their weak side. The idea being is that if you can kill as many like weaker units on your opponent's board faster than they can kill shitters on your board, you have overall more DPS than they do, ideally. The idea being is that if this, like, basically imagine this Taric dies at the very beginning of the fight because it's so weak, right? It's on the weakest side, boom, it's gone. Suddenly, it's a 5v4, and you have a much easier time winning this fight. So you really want to kill the shitters as soon as you can. You want to try to reduce the amount of units on their board. It's like, if you can kill this Taric within a second or two, and all your units are still alive, you're basically playing up a fawn for that portion of the fight, which is kind of insane. So you really want to make sure that whenever you're scouting, you want to look for the weak side and the strong side and position accordingly. Again, your carry should be against the weak side whenever possible. I will say this though, you might think like, hey, like in the early game, I can find the 3 different people. How is this advice useful to any degree? Well, the idea is that yes, you are playing the 3 different people, and it's very likely that out of those 3 people, not all 3 are going to be positioned weak side, strong side on the same side every single time. And in fact, it almost never is. Most of the time, what you're trying to do is say, hey, 2 out of 3 of my opponents, their strong side is the left side. That means ideally I should probably position on the right side, and if I low roll my matchmaking, then it is what it is. That's unfortunate, but if I'm more likely to not let that happen, right? So you want to take, like, let's say 2 out of 3 is strong side, left side. Okay, I'll position my stuff on the right side instead. Just stuff like that. These little min maxes, they seem redundant and almost useless, but the higher you climb, the more you realize that every little bit of HP really, really matters. That's why a lot of pros, a lot of top players, they talk about HP preservation all the time, because you really want to preserve your HP for as much as possible for as long as you can. It's also why you hear a lot of pros like not really liking lose streaking in general, because lose streaking, you lose a lot of that HP, and HP is crucial. It's vital. It's so difficult to garner it back. All right, but that covers most of the early game positioning that you need to know. Let's now talk about early game itemization and what we can do with it, right? So how do we maximize the most out of our items in the early game? Well, the first thing we can do is stacking our items and stacking our components. This might sound pretty obvious, but it's something that gets neglected and sort of forgotten a lot of the time. You sort of, whenever you autopilot the early game, you actually might forget that you're doing this. But you need to make sure, just make sure, because again, most of you are probably doing this. You're stacking items onto your carry or onto your main tank. Don't spread your components and don't spread your items unless you're playing something like Cybernetics, where it's a bit different. There's a different type of playstyle. But ideally, you want to be stacking your strongest units with items. The reason being is that because your strongest units will utilize the items the best. So by stacking your items onto your units, not only are you garnering more power into them, but because items actually work off of each other, you are actually garnering even more value out of those items than, say, if you were to spread items, right? Let's say, for example, we have a Deathblade and an IE, and then we throw like a GS or whatever onto our Ashe. This GS is less useful on Ashe than it is on this Jhin instead, because Jhin is just a stronger unit, but also because this GS will also work in conjunction with the Deathblade and the IE to pump out even more damage. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's a very obvious thing to keep in mind, but if you notice a lot of top tier challenger players, you might see that whenever they play the game, most of the time they have a 3-item carry by the mid game, which is something that I don't see even myself doing sometimes. This is something that I still struggle with sometimes too. But how do you do this, right? How do you achieve this? Because let's say, for example, you're like, oh, like whenever I play the game, I'm trying to play AD, but then I get dropped like a bunch of rods. Like, what do I do here, right? How do I maximize this stuff? Well, obviously this is the best case scenario, but sometimes, yeah, you're gonna be forced to like slam some like AP items or whatever. It happens sometimes, right? But ideally, you want to really try to itemize 3 items onto your main carry. Now, how do our pros able to sort of pull this off a little more consistently than you do, right? There's actually one specific reason, and this is not something that everybody does, but I think actually most people do, at least the higher elo you go. But this is something that's called component tracking. And component tracking is sort of this idea that, hey, the longer the game goes, the less likely you are to find the same component from neutrals. So, for example, I know it can sound a little difficult. I remember I was confused when I first heard it. But for example, let's say at the very beginning of the game, you're dropped a bow, a sword, and a rod. Like, I'm talking stage 1, okay? Let's say these are the very first 3 components that you were dropped. As the game progresses, we get into Krugs. We are now less likely to see another bow, another sword, another rod. We actually have a higher chance of seeing things like chain vest, seeing things like cloak, seeing things like tier, right? So this is something that you need to keep in mind as the game progresses, right? Let's say, for example, in this scenario, right, we have a Ginsu slam, right? And we know that we are going to probably slam Ginsus at 2-1. I mean, it's not always the case. Maybe it's Gunblade. It depends on the meta. But in the current meta, Ginsu seems to be okay in the spot. Maybe you slam a Ginsus and you have an open sword. Let's say that you're saying, okay, I have a Ginsu slammed. I want to play into Aphelios this game. That means I want items like GS, items like IE, items like Deathblade, stuff like that, right? So we know for a fact Aphelios likes bows. Bow items. GS, for example, Runans, stuff like that. That means on Carousel, we actually really do want to prioritize trying to grab a bow if we can, because we know we're less likely to see this. If you really, like, you're like, hey, I really like Deathblade Aphelios, I think it's really strong, you really want to prioritize getting that sword off the Carousel to really ensure, because, hey, on neutrals, there's a very good chance you're not going to see that sword, right? On the contrary, let's say, for example, you are an IE hater. You're like, IE sucks dick. I would never build this item or whatever, right? But on Carousel, right? Let's say you can't get the sword. There's no more swords. There's no more bows, right? This happens like all the time. What component would you take instead? Well, even though you hate IE, you could probably still take Crit Glove off the Carousel. Reason being is that if you take Crit Glove off the Carousel, there's a good chance that you might get dropped a tier out of neutrals, and then if you get dropped a tier out of neutrals, you can actually slam Hodge, and that's, you know, again, this is assuming that you hate IE and you like Hodge a lot, and like this is something you can do. Obviously, you do have to keep in mind that whenever you take items off the Carousel, you should be thinking, hey, I took a Crit Glove off Carousel. What if I get dropped another Crit Glove? What do I do then? And then you guys are thinking like, okay, if I get dropped another Crit Glove, then like, okay, am I okay with slamming TG, stuff like that? These are things that you have to keep in mind, like think further into the future. If you get dropped something like double Crit Glove, you might have to actually just slam the IE here in this scenario, and then you have an open Crit Glove and you play around Hodge, and that's your build, right, for your carry. In general, in the early game, you want to play around the units that you hit first, and then your items second. The reason being is that, let's say, for example, right, you get the bow, the sword, and the rod, right? But then instead of getting dropped this opener, you were dropped a different opener, which looks something like, I don't know, something like this, right? Something like this. If this is your 2-1 opener, you probably, with those same components, don't want to slam Ginsus. It doesn't make any sense. Because instead, from this scenario, you could actually either keep the components open, or if Gunblade gets buffed in the future, maybe even slam a Gunblade in the spot. It's totally okay. It does depend on what you want to do with this bow, though. You do have to think further along the lines of like, hey, how do I kill this bow component? That's something you have to keep in mind. If I get dropped a second bow, what do I do with it? Right? These are things that you have to keep in mind, but in this scenario, 100% of the time, you're not going to slam a Ginsus in this spot unless you're an absolute madman and you want to hard force Aphelios or Zarya or whatever. The reason why you want to go units first, items second is because in general, you are not rolling during the early game. it's just something that you just don't do. I know it's something that Mortdog is like, he's like, I want to change that in the future, but right now, as of the way that TFT is played, you do not roll in the early game whatsoever. And so whatever units you find are whatever units you are going to be forced to play. So don't force items that can't work onto those units. You have to accept the fact that, hey, I hit AP units this game, I should play around AP, or hey, I hit a lot of AD units, I should play around AD. If you are playing AP units and you're slamming AD items, that is a bit problematic. That means you're going to have to either pivot or you're going to have to find a way to make the components work. Sometimes you are just dealt the cards that you're dealt with, and it can be very difficult to, work with what you got. For example, I had a game where I had an Invoker start where my early game looked something along the lines of, I believe I had a Taric, I had a Soraka, Kassadin, Soraka, and like a Galio, I think. I think this was like my 2-1 opener, which is like a decent opener, but then I was dropped like sword, Kriklev, right? And then I was like, okay, how the hell am I gonna make this shit work? And then I eventually that's not Galio. But then I was like, dude, like how the fuck am I gonna make this shit work? This is just sounding like a terrible fucking time. Like, how can I make these components work? And eventually I did actually have to end up trying to make it work. I found very little AD units, so I was forced to try to play into an AP line, even though I was given these components. It sucks. It's just a low roll. It happens sometimes. But ideally, you want to play around the units first, your items second. But, stage 3-2 hits, that's sort of that's the sort of the first breaking point where you're like, okay, level 6 roll down, maybe I can sort of tech out of these units and try to pivot into something else. It's very unlikely that you have to stick around with like an AP board the entire time. Usually, at some point in the game, you will natural some AD units and you'll be able to tech out of this and try to pivot out as soon as you can. You do want to try to pivot out in the early game whenever you can, as soon as possible, in case you're stuck in this scenario, because if you don't, it will become a lot more expensive to try to pivot out, and you're actually going to find yourself deeper into an AP line that you weren't originally trying to play. You're trying to play into an AD line because of the components that you were given, right? So keep that in mind. I will say this as well, just because, let's say, for example, in that previous example, right, where we had the Soraka, the Galio, we don't really want to slam items in general here. And actually, if you don't have to slam an item, don't slam it. Ideally, you want to try to keep your components open for as long as possible. So let's say I'm like, oh, I really want to be on this win streak, right? It's very good practice not to slam the IE here unless I absolutely think it'll change the momentum of a fight. If I'm really trying to like win streak, for example, try to preserve a 5-win, right? That's something that you have to keep in mind. Again, slam at the very last second is the most optimal play. Obviously, the higher elo you go, it matters a little bit less. Only because, or sorry, not the higher elo, but the later the game goes. Only because you have so many items, and it's like, can you really agree to that point? It gets a little dicey, right? But in the early game, this is something that you can keep in mind. The last thing I want to quickly touch upon is that just some items are better early than later. So, for example, items like Warmogs, items like Sunfire Cape, these are all better in the early game and worse in the late game. These are what you might sometimes hear the term tempo slams, where you are slamming items that are a little less optimal in the late game, but at least in the early game, you're going to be able to preserve a really, really strong streak. So this is something that you can slam for now, and then you can lose a little bit of the power in those components later, but it's okay because you're able to preserve so much HP in the early game that it does not matter. There are, just to give you an idea, some of these early game tempo items are things like Deathblade, things like IE. These are all tempo slams, things that are good in the early game but fall off a bit as the game progresses. Things that are really strong late game but not as strong early are items such as Gargoyles. You garner a lot less value out of stuff like this. Protector's Vow, I wouldn't argue, I mean, this is one of those items that's kind of good all the time, but it's specifically really good in the late game because you're able to get that first initial cast off, and for a lot of really important units, such as J4, such as Cassante, you really want to get that cast off ASAP, so that is why this item is definitely more valuable in the late game, and maybe not something that you were as keen to slime in the early game. You also have things like in the late game, GS is the most obvious example where it's really, really strong in the late game, but again, a lot of these items are sort of better late game or better early game. It's usually one or the other. There's very few items such as Vow that are sort of good all the time, but again, it's pretty rare. Ionic Spark, for example, is also good all the time, because Shred is always nice, and also it just does a lot of damage. But I hope this video was helpful. I hope you guys learned a little bit about the early game. If you have any other questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Take care and happy climbing. Bye-bye now.